And today, I just want to look at some things that interest me. No different than what I always do. I think there's enough evidence on my channel to disprove the historical narrative. And I can name another dozen excellent channels who also have over 100 videos disproving, in my opinion, the narrative. But photos are an important part of it. For instance, when we look at this picture from Italy, we see that the old world had skyscrapers. When we look into our history, even in recent newspaper articles, we find that there were Egyptian ruins in the Grand Canyon. When we look at old maps, we see a nation called Tartaria on at least a few hundred different maps, and yet this nation is not taught about in schools. When we look at the realm from above, we see sophisticated layouts and feats of engineering, often found in remote places, with very little explanation. When we examine star forts, found all throughout the realm, we find some of the most sophisticated engineering, indicating these were built by a people who understand the implementation of frequency and complex geometry. And while further examining the star fort narrative, in which they are commonly called bastion forts, we are told these were to defend against cannonballs, and yet thousands of these star forts are also said to be built before the invention of the cannon. In Chicago, we're told they built 7 city halls in around a 20-year period. One of them, we were told, they demolished in order to begin building the new one right next door. And yet we do see old photos of both of them standing in controversy to the narrative. We've discussed technology that's found on the top of all of these buildings, such as seen on this post office right here. And yet how these technologies may have been reverse engineered from nature, as we can see here with these radiolaria. And the radiolaria is basically a silica sea-dwelling creature, very tiny. And it's said that their carcasses make up most of the sand. And I think it would be very easy to recreate these photos, taking pictures of old buildings with old cameras, staging them with props and people, and I have no doubt one could portray whatever story they would want to. Today we're going to check out some old buildings left over from the Chicago World's Fair. Welcome. And this is a model city. It's called Wonderland. It's located in Hamburg, Germany. The model occupies 16,000 square feet, 1,300 trains, 10,000 carriages, 100,000 moving vehicles, 500,000 lights, 130,000 trees, and 400,000 human figurines. And as I've said in at least every other video, I don't know. I only research what interests me. And if I thought I knew, then I would stop researching. And before this, I was looking at my local animal shelter page, and I was very sad. Very, very sad. And maybe this research just takes me away. So I was just looking at the Google Earth here, and I found myself in Chicago. And we're told they built over 100 buildings for the World's Fair, and that they were temporary, and they tore 95% of them down. And at least we have a few left. I think it's pretty safe to say that they all had the same style. We should be able to recognize them. And here I've just punched in Columbia Exposition, and it's given me 5 pins. So let's have a look. And just starting off, we see a very large span. Today, I think you could hold a fair in just this park here. Pretty insane distance And if that's the case, I would imagine there's a lot of ruins remaining all throughout here. As always, before we get started, I just want to pay notice to the artificial coastlines. If I ever get sick of looking at buildings, I may just focus exclusively on these artificial coastlines, in which zero explanation is given. My theory, of course, is that these are from a past civilization, perhaps the remains of star forts and other such engineering. But back to our remaining buildings. Here we have the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and clearly we can see the gardens from the World's Fair remaining, and I'm glad they didn't just build on top of these. And here is our School of the Art Institute. Just massive, taking up several blocks, a courtyard here, and this thing can be seen better from a street view. We'll drop the little man down here, and here we go. Left over from the World's Fair, and we recognize it right away. And here they've inscribed a new designation over the top here. Very easy way to change the designation of the building. And not only the designation, but also the date of buildings. As we can see here, you can add 1,000 years to your timeline simply by changing this facade. And here I don't think that this building was ever temporary. And I think it's looking even less glorious than it did in the past. Were these windows always filled in like this? I'm not sure, but let's move on. Next we stroll across this massive park, and we have the Field Museum. And we can drop the little man down here, and here's what we get. A beautiful building. This could have been any kind of government building, city hall, federal something or another, and looking pretty permanent. Here are 2 buildings remaining, and I just can't help but feel that if these buildings resemble all the photos we see, it may be safe to assume that all of these buildings were just as permanent as these leftovers. And here, how appropriate, a crappy tent just to show you how much we really care today. And it looks like they've turned this into an aquarium. So very exciting. Already more buildings remaining than I thought. And this doesn't seem like it was ever meant to be an aquarium originally. And let's move on. Now here we see the Soldier Field. I made a video on this in the past, and I don't think this was ever originally meant to be a sports center. I'm not sure what the purpose would have been. If we look at old photographs, it looks like there were 3 buildings around what may at one point have been a lake. I'm just not sure. But let me show you the original front of this Soldier Field, and here we go. You can see my point. It does not seem like it was originally intended to be for sporting events. I love this structure. And in modern times, they actually made it smaller. They've built a new sports center within the old one. And really, again, feeling like this was built by the same people at the same time for some other purpose. Seems like everything we do is for amusement now, as if that's the only way we can sell this narrative. And again, that's not even supposed to be a World's Fair building, and yet it's directly on this path, really making me feel like it was just a grand residence, the uppity part of town in this past civilization, similar to what we see at the St. Louis World's Fair, where you had over 70 acres, and the layout just looked like a neighborhood, and like all of these buildings were simply residences. But here in the case of these Chicago buildings, they're even more massive than the ones in St. Louis. I think too big to be a private residence. And here we have a park. Looks like there was a building here at one point. And lastly, it looks like we have this Iowa building. Not very impressive. But in actuality, this must be it right here. Somebody has put the pin on this little one, when really it's clearly this mind blower right here. And what the hell is the Iowa building? Unbelievable here. Looking like a machine, and a smaller one right here with domes again over here. This thing is like a key component in the circuit board. Even having water here, maybe to cool some kind of machinery or tech, I'm not sure, but this is way too impressive. And it really isn't just the building, it's this whole layout. This is so advanced. And let's see what it is today. The Museum of Science and Industry. And clearly an old World's Fair building. No real indication, but again, this is their mark. The building of transportation, the building of science, agriculture, fine arts. We've heard it all, and we've seen them all, and this is one of them. A bunch of junk out here, and let's see if we can't park the man. And there we go. Clearly doing some renovation. So what do you think? These are just some of the remaining buildings. And I think what's pretty clear is that these remaining ones are not temporary. And of course I don't know, but I only suggest that if these remaining World's Fair buildings were made of such fine quality and clearly have stood the test of time, then all these other ones were just as permanent as these. It's said that it's better not to begin, but once begun, it's better to finish. And where is all this research leading us? I think to understand our false history is very important, but ultimately that brings us to our false present, which is even more important. But I think one step lends to the other, and perhaps an important prerequisite before we can consider how we should really live. And how should we really live? A lot of people will spend a lifetime blaming others, especially in this case, blaming the controllers it might be. Oh, look what they've done to us. And they have. But complaining about it is only good to a certain point. We have to consider our next step. And if we don't take the next step, there's no one to blame. Yes, when you realize the system is completely backwards, and we're no better off than slaves living in this glorified feedlot, full of amusements, but also unnecessary burdens placed on life. Burdens that even the wild animals don't share. Certainly when you realize history is false, you wouldn't pay for a false education and indoctrination. Some people spending hundreds of thousands on such a worthless piece of paper. And time. But how would you live if it was completely up to you? If nobody was stopping you? Some would enjoy to continue the rat race, such as my family, even if presented with this knowledge. But personally, I would choose to live as naturally as possible. I would want to eliminate the high expenditure and cost of living wherever possible, and mostly this is housing, power, and food. Nothing mysterious about it, and anyone can jump off grid and eliminate at least 50% of the madness that we are conditioned to accept as normal. But even if you were to do that, how free are you? What's left? I typically preach independence and not fighting with others. But in this case, it's the very same system that will come after you. We, of course, have God-given rights in most presumed free nations, but the lawmakers create new laws which seem to directly oppose our God-given rights and our most foundational documents of law, including the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And suddenly we might receive a nasty letter and feel drawn into the system. And we are. And what do? Comply? And we're taught in law that we must comply. This is an honorable position. We must respond. And this idea of law and freedom is the heaviest research in my life, and I think the most important because it will teach us to navigate these treacherous waters that we seem to be drawn into every now and then. And so recently I was sent a nasty letter threatening taxes, jail time, fines, tearing down of my house, and all kinds of other things. But all threats, all assumptions, followed by accusations. And at first, being like most of us, I thought I would just pay, and was more than happy to just pay and be left alone. But upon reading the letter further, there were all kinds of suspicious words, questionable words, threats backed with no facts, and very simply things that I didn't understand. I did not understand their position, and my natural inclination again would have been to pay, but I also realized upon further contemplation that this paying would also be an admittance to anything in this vague letter I was sent, opening the door for many other subsequential issues. And I don't know much. I wish I would have spent years researching the law. Instead, I've devoted my time to history, and yet I can clearly see that one, in a practical sense, is more important than the other once we've woken up. So I decided to use what little knowledge I have and apply it, my conviction rooted in my God-given rights. And I wrote a letter, and I thought I would share it. It's not everything I wish I could have said, and as always, I wish I could have said it better, but I said something, and I'll explain to you why. So first I said thank you for reaching out, being honorable, and setting the tone. No response is dishonorable and can be taken as a disfavorable position. I said I conditionally accept your offer to increase my property taxes under the condition that we have the true facts presented. Again, I thought this was very fair. I'm accepting their offer, but under conditions. And these conditions can be anything. And just with this little first line, I encourage you. We have the rights to question all writings. These people are trying to create contract with me. Otherwise, they would have just sent me a bill. Very short and simple. But instead, they sent this semi-threatening, accusatory letter. And very similar to a police officer that pulls you over for no reason and begins asking you questions. And the idea is that we can ask the questions. We don't need to be backed up into a corner. If somebody sends you a letter demanding money, then we must simply ask questions and determine if this is a valid claim. Next, I said to determine the true facts, my questions below must be answered within 15 days upon deliverance of this letter, or there shall be no valid claim. And again, this is very fair and honorable. I've given more than 2 weeks' time, and also building into the structure of this letter a way for this contract to fail. If they don't answer my questions, or if they don't answer my questions within the time period, this weakens their position, as I have been honorable. Then I say, your letter states it appears that the structures were built without a building permit. Can you prove these structures were required to file for a permit and not within the parameters of buildings that do not require a building permit? Now I happen to know that my buildings do fall within the perimeters of buildings that would not require a building permit. My original dwelling is a modest camping trailer, no permit required. And there are 2 structures on either side that also are small enough to not require a permit. So I've simply asked them. I haven't told them what I just told you. This, as in poker, is my hand. I don't need to admit anything, but I do need to have my ducks in order. I am simply asking them questions to see if their claim is valid. And this would be the same with banks and creditors and anybody really who would be making any kind of claim against you. And then this part maybe I shouldn't have put in here. I don't know. Again, I was winging it. Is it pompous of me to put this statement in here? Nevertheless, it's truth. "The whom creates the accusation shall bear the burden of proof." And this is why we have the Fifth Amendment. People want us to talk and ruin our position, and we mustn't. It's they who bears the burden of proof. Next I asked, can you define appears? Is this a fact? And appears is not a fact. What we learn in law is our law is full of verbiage and adverbs, and these are not facts. Now this part, I question if I should have written, "The letter does not seem to be based on facts but rather assumptions. Can you show any factual evidence? And if so, how was this determined?" This part is pretty important. Did they trespass on my property to determine this? Was this some anonymous tip, again based on zero facts? So I've simply asked the question, asking for the facts, not appearances or assumptions. This part, I don't know if it was such a good idea on my part, but the letter did say if you wish to make payments, please contact the Treasurer's Department, and I did, and they told me no taxes were due. So I've simply asked them to define wish, seeming to be reserved for a genie, typically, not contracts. I do not wish to pay, but I didn't say that. And then, as my last question, and I could have asked so many, and I have the rights to, I asked, does this organization represent the higher laws of the land, including but not limited to the Constitution, federal, and common law? Again, who am I dealing with? Come to find out, these governments are merely corporations, not acting in the benefit of the people. Corporations making money. And this seems to be the foundation of our false history. Corporations creating governments, and ultimately slave systems. And this last part I copied from a debt validation letter, something you would send to a creditor or a credit bureau. And I couldn't have written this any better, so I just copied it and stuck it on here. And it says, "This presentment shall constitute a claim against the assets of your institution and is valid upon your failure to comply with the requirements of this agreement and to validate, not verify, the comprehensive accounting. Failure to respond within 15 days will be deemed non-responsive. The undersigned extends to the respondents the undersigned's appreciation and thanks for respondents' prompt attention to the response of the above proof of claim. This presentment is not to be construed as an acceptance or admittance to any jurisdiction, quasi or otherwise, but shall remain as a direct objection to any and all claims to the contrary." And again, I couldn't have said it any better, and just thought I would stick this part in here, which is basically saying I remain opposed to any of these claims. I'm not admitting or accepting anything at this point. Sincerely, without recourse. So I don't know. Will I end up being fined? Have I made the situation worse? We'll see. But even like the wild animal living free in nature, occasionally we are tested, and we have the opportunity to respond and treat the system a little differently than we have in the past. And maybe it is possible to rebuild this realm for the better once we truly understand the system and our role in it. Not to be subservient, but to be informed and to participate. So I guess that's it. If you missed my video last week, I posted it to my other channel because I didn't like it. But for today, have a blessed day. Please like, comment, and subscribe.